Welcome to this demo class on object-oriented programming. Myself N. Karthikeyan, Assistant Professor, Department of CSE, Government College of Engineering, Singipati, Tanjavur. So in this video, I'm going to explain the concept of constructors in an inheritance hierarchy. We know that the constructors are normally used to assign the value for a instance variable of the data member. So that there are different type of constructors will be supported. One is a default, parameterized, and a copy constructor. So in this class, just I am going to discuss the concept of concept means a constructors in both and derived classes. So that by using and also just I am going to explain how the constructors are invoked in both base and base as well as in derived class. Okay, let us first I'm going to discuss with this example, then I can get to final conclusion. I'm going to create a one base class. For example, my base class name is a base. So I'm going to derive a class from a base class. So extends from a base. So there are two private classes. I'm going to use only single level inheritance for showing a demo. So then just I'm going to set up create a single entry point that is called main function. Okay, so now it's same. So just I'm going to define it. First of all, I'm going to discuss on default constructor. We know that for the default constructor, the class name and function names are same. Here I didn't receive any, I didn't initialize any data member. So that just I can use only one print statement to show whether it will work it or not. Means what's the basis it will work. So that so I'm saying I'm in base class default constructor. So like that, just I'm going to define derived class. Okay, now before that, I don't want to create any object here. Means any method, any constructors. Just I have an empty class definition. We know that by using the object of derived classes, we can able to access all the properties of the base classes also. Just I will save it. Just I'm going to run it. We know that here there is no function, the class definitions we have, so that no method will be invoked. And also we know that the constructors are invoked at the time of compilation itself. So that, but here we didn't have any constructors, so that there is no problem on my codes. So that means the program should not give any output for that. But here there are three classes should be created. So one is for base derived, another one is for main functions. So no output will be created because we don't have any action inside of this definition. Okay. So now I'm going to create a one base class constructor. So I have a default constructor in base class. So see that there is no comments argument we have for the base class constructor. So that it is called as a default constructor. So the default constructor is used to assign a default, but here we don't have any instance variable. So just I can use one print statement to show a demo. So that if I'm using I'm running the code. Sorry. Just run a code so that it executes. I'm in a base and default constructor is execute class. Okay, means always the constructor execution from base, but actually the control will be transferred from derived classes to base class. So just I'm going to call the method derived. So I am in derived class, and just I can change it. So just a constructor. So now both the base and derived classes have a default constructor. Now you have to check what is the working principle of this default constructors, which is present in both base class as well as in derived class. So no error, just I'm going to run it. So that from this we can say that the execution order is from base classes to the derived class. So just I'm going to explain the working principle of this program by using the tracing method by using C++ because I'm not having any framework manual. So that's just I'm going to show you a demo by using C++ by tracing the executions. So always whenever we have a default constructor, here the constructor is in base class and derived classes are optional. But if it is, always the constructor execution must take places from base classes to derived class. So this is the execution hierarchy. But when you work with this, when you're working under the constructors, always we must be familiar about the constructor concept. So always the constructor execution in inheritance hierarchy must work takes place from base classes to derivative class. It's not, I mean, always in a constructor, irrespective of the type. So we know that there are three types of constructors we have. One is a base class, parameters to constructor, default to constructor, as well as and a copy constructor. There are three types of constructors we have. So don't worry about the syntax of your class concepts in C++. And just we can understand which is a constructor. So I am in base class. So here in C++, the class definitions are terminated with semicolon. So I am going to derive a class from base. So here I am going to define one constructor. So that is derived. It is also a default constructor. So just I am going to define that cout. So I am in derived. So I am going to create a main function. So we know that the constructors are invoked at the time of object creation itself. So that simply I am going to create an object for the derived class. So then automatically means that the constructors will be invoked. Just I can showcase with the help of an examples. So see that, so just I can show it now. So I'm going to create a press 7. So we know that always execution from taken places from the single point of single entry point, so that the clear screen clear everything. So now that object is created, we know that once the object is created, the constructors is executed automatically. So initially, first of all, the control transfer to the that particular base the object of the particular corresponding class. Here the object is created only for derived class, so that the control will be transferred to the object the constructor of the derived class. It is a default constructor. So then after that, automatically the constructor will be the execution flow will be transferred to the immediate base class. So then again the constructors in the base classes will be executed, and then followed by the derived class will be executed. So this is the output of the program. In case there is one more intermediate classes also created. So intermediate classes also created. So that by using base classes public, base classes base as a base class. So just I also created a one constructor here. So intermediate. So see out. So I am in intermediate derived. Intermediate derived. It is default constructor. So the hierarchy I'm creator. Just I'm compile. No errors. Just I'm going to trace the program execution. So as usual, the object is creator, so that always we know that the control flow will be forwarded to the derived class. Again, the control from the derived class or constructor to the control will be transferred to the immediate base class. So that here the immediate base class is intermediate. Again, that intermediate base class will be forwarded to the control to the immediate base class. So that immediate base class is a base. But after that, we don't have any constructor, so that it will execute from top of the base classes to higher the higher top of the top base classes to the top base class, then followed by the intermediate class, then followed with the derived class. So this is the execution order. The constructors will be executed. See that it will be executed like this. So from that we can clearly understand that so the concept of the constructors will be executed means always in generally. So in an inheritance hierarchy, if we have a default constructor, always the execution takes place from the base classes to derived class, but the control flow taken from the base to derived, derived to base, then the execution taken places from base classes to derived class. Even if you have a derived classes also, we have the intermediate classes, no issue. Again, the same procedure what we discussed in C++, the same concept, same procedure will be worked here. So I'm going to use derived here, intermediate. So just I'm going to change one small correction in a printf. Now now the print statement. I'm in an intermediate class. So the constructor name must be changed. So now it changed, and here the intermediate is intermediate. Sorry, I mean here I used multi-level hierarchy. Sorry, multiple means a multi-level hierarchy. I just created, so that object is created. So now, so we know that based on the object is creation, that execution takes place. Here the object is created for that means that lowest with a derived class, so that the execution taken places from derived to means that base to intermediate to derived. So that is a working hierarchy for execution. So that the first of all the base class default constructor is executed, followed by the intermediate class, then followed by the derived class. Okay. So for example, if I don't have any constructor in base class, means I don't have any constructor in base class, means that I'm going to hide it. So here the base class constructor is hidden. So now just I'm going to compile. So that even the default constructor is optional, so that the execution from taken from that intermediate classes and derived classes. For example, we don't have a constructors in derived classes. Just to see that what will happen. Actually, here there is no constraint that we should have a constructor in all the classes for only for default constructor, but not for parameterized constructor. So if you have a default constructor, the default constructors in every classes are optional. So if we have a default constructor, it will execute. Doesn't mean that we must to have a default constructor in our classes. So that see that I'm going to see that. So that if we have a default constructor in our logic, assume that if we have a default constructor in our program, so that in a base class, if we have a default constructors allowed, so the execution order is taken from the base to derived classes, but the availability of the default constructor in the inheritance hierarchy is optional. If we have a default constructor, it will execute. Okay, so now we move on to the parameterized constructor. So just I'm going to remove this intermediate constructor. I'm going to remove this intermediate constructor now. Intermediate classes now, just for understanding purpose. Okay, first of all, I'm going to add a intermediate. I'm going to add I'm going to define one data number inside of the base class. Another one, I'm going to create another one instance variable for the derived class. Okay, but here just I'm including one parameterized constructor for a base class, not for a derived class. Check it, what will happen. So this is called a parameterized constructor. But here I didn't initialize it anything. If you want, we can initialize. Okay, I'm going to say that this dot equal to, because otherwise the meaningful will be changed. But even though if you're not this initialization takes place, it's not defined, then the compiler not making any error message and all. But we can make it as a parameterized so that I can try to initialize the value for the instance variable from the local variable. But actually that is an optional part. But here there is only for the concept explanation, so that I'm not going to give the important part that the use of those instance variable. So now we have to check it. Just I'm compile, no error. Just I'm going to run it. So that so there is a search method is error that is called one small correction. That the base is not defined, so that it makes a runtime error. Okay, so just I'm going to compile now. So in the constructor base in the class cannot be applied to the given time, because means that there is a data type. That means that how to say that if you have a parameterized constructor, means that if you have an object, so if you are defining the parameterized constructor in a base class, at least means that we must to have a constructor in derived class also. It means that so if you have a parameterized constructor in a base class, the same parameter, at least we must to define a one base default constructor in a base class, so that it will not make any error messages and all. So just I'm going to create a base class constructor now. So it is in default constructor. So because that means that the control will be transferred based on the number of arguments. So that if you are doing like that, so that we can check it. No error will be taken place. So normally always the derivative class is tried to forward that means forward the control transfer to the constructor. So that if we have a derivative class constructor, so normally always the derivative class to forward that control to the default constructor. So but actually in a base class here we defined only the parameterized constructor. So that but in a base class we have means always it map to only the default constructor. But if we are defined a parameterized constructor, so it leads to define a parameterized default constructor. At least we have to define a default constructor to the base class. Clear? Okay. So from there we can easy to understand that. Just we can check it. It will execute only the default constructor because always the parameterized constructor only to map with that. So that means to map with your means only it will map to the corresponding constructor. So here it is a general always that derivative class to map with only default constructors. Okay, so let us take that I am going to define a parameterized constructor in base class. Sorry, in derived class. So I am going to define two arguments. One is two data member. Assume that I am going to make it as a parameterized constructor. So as we know that if normally if you are defining parameterized constructor, the default class always to map to default constructors. So for example, if I forget to map with this base class, just I'm going to hide this default constructor. But even though whatever the constructors we defined in the derivative class, it always to map to derivative base classes. I mean, it's a base class default constructor only. So that there is a major condition. If you have a parameterized constructor, the corresponding immediate base classes must have, at least it must have a default constructor. So here there is a one problem there. So here we are trying to create an object for the default constructor, but we don't have any default constructor in derivative classes, so that the matching not taken place. So now I'm going to change the procedure. So now it will execute for the default parameterized constructor. Now I'm going to compile. So always try to understand that if you are defining means if you are having any type of constructor, that is not a problem. If you have a parameterized constructor in a base class, we must to have means the immediate base classes and further means topmost base classes. We must to define a derivative class. I mean say default constructor. Clear? So the same error will be displayed. So that at least we must to have a default constructor. Clear? So at least it map only the default constructor to the base class. Now you have to check in. So in a construct in base classes means normally in derivative classes only the number of parameters in the constructors are matched. So that but here the constructors will not means even though the parameterized constructor is executed in the derivative class, the control will not be transferred to the parameterized constructor to the immediate base classes. Always the default it must map to the default constructors. See that? So the in base class it map with the default constructor, but in derivative class it map with the parameterized constructor, because always we know that the match always that the execution taken places from means that the control immediately transfer to the immediate derivative class. Then again before execution of the constructors in the derivative class, the control will be transferred to the immediate base class. So like that it will work. So generally parameterized constructor always to map with default constructor of the your immediate base classes. Okay, so now the question many often think that if you want to map a control to base classes means that the derivative means that a parameterized constructor of your immediate base classes control to the immediate base class, the parameterized constructor of immediate base classes, we have to use a super keyword. Only we have to make, and if the super means in the constructor hierarchy, calling if your parameterized constructor of your immediate base class, the super method must be the function calling must be taken places as a first statement. Not possible to define this super at the end. I can show it now. So in a default, normally it map with only the base class default or default constructor. In order to change that, we have to use means a super keyword to make it to execute your corresponding parameterized constructor for the execution hierarchy. So now with the help of this super keyword, the concept of parameterized constructor will work. Clear? In case if the super is missing, so the concept of this super is missing, that means that not defined, always the parameterized, means the derivative class to map to the default constructor, so that the base class it will execute the default, and in derivative class it execute for parameterized. Just we can check it, so that in base class it execute only the default constructor, so it is in general. So from that we can clearly to know that so if we have a parameterized constructor, means if we have a parameterized constructor, so if we have a parameterized and parameterized, by invoking this parameterized constructor of your base class from derived class, we have to use super keyword to invoke. So if you are defining a parameterized constructor in a derived class, we must to have at least we must to define a default constructor in base class. That is a very, very important, means at least we need to define one constructor for an execution hierarchy. Clear? So same way we can check for a copy constructor. So we know that copy constructor, it is a process of passing the object as an argument. So I'm going to create another one more objects. So derived, so d equal to new, sorry, that object name I can change, new equal new derived, and I'm going to pass a d1 as object. So that here it will not match with this because it is a primary data type as argument. So this is a copy parameterized constructor, but I need a copy constructor so that I can go with the copy constructors now. This object will be passed as argument. So it is like as a parameterized constructors only, so that system.out.println. So I am in derived. So that is copy constructor. So just I'm going to run this. So D1 may not be initialized. So sorry. So here a copy from already initialized object, so that my object is D, not a D1. So we know that compares Java is strictly sensitive, so that if the initialization not possible, then it show an error message. So that's either the first one for parameterized constructor and second one for copy constructor. Even though it is work with the basic principle of copy constructor, any constructor and derivative class always to map with your immediate default constructor value. So that if you are going to define a parameterized constructor and derivative class, at least the base class must have a default constructor. At least is to must have a default constructor. But if you want to map a parameterized constructor of the derivative classes to parameterized constructor of a base class, we have to use the function call as by using super. By using a super keyword, we can make a function call to make a parameterized call to the base classes. Otherwise, in default, it will execute only for the default. In general, it will map with your default constructor. So this is the way the concept of constructors will be worked in Java. So just I can recall once again. So anyway, we have to define a we have to, for example, if you have a default constructor, that means that it is optional. So it maybe the base class or intermediate class or maybe derivative class, everything maybe have a default constructor. Always the execution hierarchy from base classes to derivative class. It may be on default constructor or maybe on parameters constructor, whatever may be. In an inheritance hierarchy, always the execution taken place from from default constructor, means from top to bottom. That is called base classes to final, means a derivative class. Okay, so if you have to define a parameterized constructor, we know that parameterized constructor is to initialize the different values for the data member instead of this default value. So that if you have a parameterized constructor in derivative class, so if you have a default parameterized constructor in base classes, so if you have to map a function, generally always a derivative class to execute transfer the control to the base class default constructor of the base classes. In order to change this flow by using the super, we can make it, but actually the super by making a transfer to the parameterized constructor for the immediate base classes, we have to use a super keyword. By using this super function call, we can make a transfer to the control to the parameterized constructor of your immediate base classes instead of default constructor. So that for always that calling of this a super must be a first statement of your programming. It means a first statement of your constructor statement. If you are trying to define after that first, means that after some action, surely it makes an error message. So that always the constructor execution, either maybe a copy constructor or maybe a parameterized or maybe a default constructor, the execution starts from base to derived, but the control flow may be taken from derivative to base, then it starts to execute. So that after most derivative class, base classes to the derivative classes will be executed. So this is the way the constructor hierarchy will work in Java. Thank you.